everybody, and welcome to Heel Heat. My name is George Coles, and on this episode, we're doing a top 10. Topic of the top 10, IWGP Heavyweight Champions. Now, this is a title lineage that runs from June 12th, 1987 to March 4th, 2021. That was just replaced with the IWGP World Heavyweight Championship. The top 10 best IWGP Heavyweight Champions. Now, for this ranking, there's a few things that we're going to take into effect. The number of title reigns, the number of defenses, the amount of days they were champion, and overall impact. Overall impact is going to be the main one, but the other three are also going to be part of it. So, let's say overall impact is 40%, and each other one is 20% of it. With that being said, let's jump right into the list. Number 10, AJ Styles. AJ Styles had 2 reigns, defended the belt 3 times, and held the championship for 307 days. Now, that does sound like a lot. It does sound very impressive. Once we get to some of these other numbers, you'll see it's not as much. AJ, however, has the distinction of being the second leader of the Bullet Club, coming after Prince Devitt, aka Finn Balor, and it could be argued that AJ was the one in charge of the Bullet Club when the Bullet Club first started to take off. I will argue it every day, and I love AJ's work both in WWE and in TNA. AJ Styles' best work came in that 1 year that he was in New Japan. He did some of the best work of his career there, some of the best work any wrestlers ever did anywhere, AJ did there. And this was where the Bullet Club went from something that a few people knew that was happening in Japan to something that was on the tip of every wrestling fan's tongue. And it was on the back of AJ Styles carrying that ball, having amazing matches. Obviously, there's a lot to say about the logo and the t-shirt that went into that. The whole feel of the Bullet Club, the whole vibe of that, especially during AJ's reign, is the reason why AJ made this list. Now, number 9, Riki Choshu. Riki Choshu had 3 title reigns, defended the belt 5 times, and was champion for 325 days. Now, Riki Choshu, much like AJ Styles, he's a guy that kind of was the second wave, like AJ was the second wave of the Bullet Club. Riki Choshu was kind of the second ace of the company behind the creator Antonio Inoki. And Choshu, really, for those early 90s runs, he was a fantastic ambassador. He was a fantastic wrestler. He really carried the belt, helped to make the lineage what it is today, helped to make it something where you really wanted to go for this championship. Him holding that belt and him being the IWGP champion made that belt more. It was one of those instances where the wrestler made the belt more important, thus making the wrestler more important, all being a symbiotic experience. And he's a guy that, when I think back, and I think really fondly of getting the tapes in the early 90s, of tapes of the wrestling from Japan, watching all his matches and absolutely loving them. I love Riki Choshu. He was one of my favorites of the time frame. And I think he's kind of a guy that a lot of people don't really look back and think highly of, or not that they don't think highly, but he's not on these lists a lot. He's not someone that's looked at as being influential by a lot of people. He gets looked over, is what I'm meaning to say. And I think it's a shame, because if you really look back at his body of work, the dude was absolutely amazing. Now from that, our number 8. From around the same era, Kensuke Sasuke, the Power Warrior. Now, this is another one that has a soft spot, and I'm going to mention it here. He had 5 reigns, 11 defenses for 647 days, so almost 2 years holding the belt. The Power Warrior, or Sasuke, I always call him Power Warrior because that's what he sticks out to me as, especially hearing the Japanese commentary, because back in the day, we didn't have Kevin Kelly to call our matches. If we watched Japanese wrestling, we got the Japanese commentary, so you would hear Power Warrior over his match. And I know that's a terrible, stereotypical type accent, but it's basically what it sounded like. He was so awesome. I mean, he tagged with Hawk, and they were kind of a proto Road Warriors. Another guy, much like Choshu, who I think the era of New Japan that he was in, he was kind of overshadowed by some other guys, but he absolutely was an amazing talent. He was a great wrestler, and he definitely deserves to be on the list. Now, our number 7, the guy whose shirt I'm wearing right now, Big Van Vader. Vader had 3 reigns, 4 title defenses, and held the belt for 451 days. So a little bit over a year. Vader, to me, was another one of those early IWGP champions that really defined what it was to be an IWGP champion. When Vader held the belt, there was Vader and maybe 2 or 3 other wrestlers in the entire world that were on Vader's level. You can maybe put Ric Flair up there. You could probably put a couple others if you really think about it. Sting, maybe, Barry Windham. But Vader was that guy. And he was one of the guys that kind of bridged the gap in that really first wave of American wrestling fans really paying attention to what was happening in New Japan. And yes, I know during the 80s there was tape trading as well, and Japanese tapes got traded then. But it really picked up in the early 90s, and one of the reasons for that was Vader, was the fact that you had this guy that people would see show up in WCW, and you would hear the lore. You would hear he was a champion in Japan. You would hear he was a champion in Germany. And he absolutely dominated for that first run in WCW. Absolutely dominated in New Japan as well. He debuts in New Japan beating Antonio Inoki. There is no bigger honor than doing that. I mean, if you really think about it, in the history of wrestling, that would be like coming in, debuting at WrestleMania, and beating The Undertaker before he lost his streak. That's how big of a deal that was at the time. And it really sent shockwaves all through the wrestling industry. With all that, that's why Vader made our list. Now, our number 6. Another guy from around that early 90s era, Tatsumi Fujinami, the Dragon. Fujinami had 6 reigns, defended the belt 13 times, and carried it for 785 days, or just a little bit over 2 years. And I might have my math a little bit wrong there. I think I'm right. But anyway, if I'm wrong, correct me down here in the comments. Fujinami's a guy, you can look at it, it's as simple as this. He is one of the few wrestlers from Japan that's in the WWE Hall of Fame, and went in with a normal induction, didn't have a Legends induction. Fujinami, again, much like Choshu, much like Sasaki, much like Vader, in those early IWGP years, the early years of the title, really helped hash out that what it meant to be a champion and how it is to carry that champion. To me, he always kind of reminded me a lot of Harley Race. He had that Harley vibe where you knew he was a champion because he carried himself like a champion. And it wasn't like he was flashy like Ric Flair was, or he had an overwhelming popularity. He did have an overwhelming popularity. What I meant to say was he didn't have like an overwhelming personality like Hulk Hogan did. But what he was just an absolute pro's pro. He was a consummate professional, absolute stud, one of the real legends of Japanese wrestling, and definitely one of the guys that helped make that title how important it would eventually become. Now, coming from that, our number 5, Shenya Hashimoto. Hashimoto got the belt for 3 times, got 20 defenses, so our most defenses that we've had so far, and carried it for 1,052 days, so just under 3 years, just under 3 years combined. Hashimoto is one of the guys, another one of those late 90s pillars of New Japan Pro Wrestling. He was so great. I mean, if you look at some of the stuff he did, you had him. Obviously, you had other guys like Kawada and Kenta Kobayashi were all out there around the same time. All while you had guys like Masahiro Chono, Kenji Muto coming through, and they were all doing their thing. It was one of the really great times to be a fan of professional wrestling, especially Japanese professional wrestling. And the really exciting thing was having the different companies, having New Japan and All Japan, and then eventually Noah coming onto the scene and 0-1, and all of these great companies with great talent in every company, it seemed. Hashimoto is another guy who's kind of takes a backseat to some of the other legends, but he's absolute stud. Absolutely loved everything about Hashimoto. He was one of my favorites of that time frame, especially later on. I believe If I remember right, and if I quote this wrong, I do apologize. He did go on to create Zero One, or he was a very important cog in Zero One, which I thought was an awesome promotion as well. Love Hashimoto. That's why he made our list. Now our number 4, a contemporary of this time frame, Hiroshi Tanahashi. Tanahashi has 8 reigns, 28 defenses, and held the belt for 1,396 days. So roughly, give or take, a little bit over 3 years. I might be wrong on the math again. I'm doing this off the top of my head. A little bit over 3 years, almost 4 years. Tanahashi is the guy who helped bring New Japan out of quote-unquote the dark ages of the early 2000s Enokiism, which I don't want to talk badly about Enoki because you're going to see at the end why I even made this list. Tanahashi took New Japan from where it was in a serious downtime and really brought it up to where it is now, to where it's looked at as one of the top promotions on all of wrestling in the world. And he was the guy. He was the ace of the company. To me, he always has a comparison to someone like John Cena or Randy Orton, where he's just that steady, always going to be there, always going to have great matches, always going to be near the top of the card, and his believability and his likability are through the roof. I love Tanahashi. I kind of hate that he's somewhat gone to a lesser role now, because I think he still has a lot of really good years in him, and I know his body has taken a lot of abuse, but he's absolutely an amazing talent. He said it himself, he's a once-in-a-generation talent, or a once-every-100 years talent. I firmly believe that that's true. Like I said, he compares to me to a John Cena with the longevity that he did it at the spot that he did it in. I don't think we're going to get too many more of them, and as you see on this list, a lot of these guys didn't have that long of a run. They might have had runs in their careers, but on the very top of the board, on the top of the food chain, as the ace of the company, you can't deny how important Tanahashi was and still is to New Japan Pro Wrestling. Now coming from that, our number 3, I mentioned him a little bit ago, Kenji Muto, aka the Great Muta. He won it 4 times, twice in each gimmick, and I love the fact that is a thing. He had 4 reigns, 19 defenses, and carried the belt for 1,238 days. The reason why I would put Muta here above someone like Tanahashi is the worldwide factor. Muta, to this day, if he shows up in America, a good portion of the wrestling fans, and I'm not talking to smart fans, if Muta was to show up in WWE on Monday Night Raw, about 50% of the fans would know who he was. If Tanahashi showed up on Monday Night Raw, you might get 30% of the fans. And that's just talking about the impact. And a lot of that is due to the partnership that New Japan Pro Wrestling had with WCW when WCW was at its absolute hottest point. The character, the Great Muta, he is one of my favorite characters, especially in the Muta character. Famously, I have hundreds of wrestling autographs, and there's only about 5 autographs that I have on my wall. I have a TNA card that's signed by a lot of different TNA wrestlers that is special because it was from my birthday. I went to a show on my birthday, and there's a lot of signatures on there, so it's more about the birthday. I have Dusty Rhodes' autograph that I have on my wall, Dusty Rhodes and Melina, but more so because it's Dusty Rhodes. I have Shinsuke Nakamura's autograph on my wall. I have Rob Van Dam and Paul Heyman's autograph from the One Night Stand. It's a picture from One Night Stand when RVD finally won the WWE Championship. And the other wrestler whose autograph is on my wall is the Great Muta. That's how much I love the Great Muta, and I might be biased. That might be why he's up so high. But look at the numbers. The numbers don't lie on his importance. The Great Muta, one of the absolute legends, a guy who I think is a no-brainer Hall of Fame talent in any wrestling Hall of Fame you want to consider, whether it be WWE, whether it be one of the independent Hall of Fames, if New Japan starts a Hall of Fame, even if AEW, which he showed up one time to, started a Hall of Fame, you'd have to put the guy in there. Now coming from that, our number 2, another contemporary of this era, and still on the top of his game, Kazuchika Okada. Okada's had 5 reigns, defended the belt 30 times, which I believe is the most, for a total of 1,790 days. So if you think about that, that's more than 4 years of the 34 years of the championship. 4 of those years were held by Kazuchika Okada himself. Much like I talked about with Tanahashi, Okada's really been a guy that helped push New Japan into the forefront, that really pushed New Japan to the heights where it is now. Him and Tanahashi's rivalry, him and Kenny Omega's rivalry, his rivalry with Naito, all of his work, I mean, the guy is absolutely going to go down as one of the greats of all time, no matter what generation, no matter what organization you talk about. Kazuchika Okada is an absolutely special talent, and he really, really is someone who I think, if New Japan didn't have Okada right now, they may not be in the place that they are. The lion's share of the work in New Japan has been carried by Okada and Tanahashi. Don't get him out of here. For the last 10 to 15 years, these were the 2 guys building the prominence of the company. Now, before we get into our number 1, we do a thing here on our top 10s called the best of the rest. Basically, these are guys that were considered for the list but didn't quite make it for whatever reason. First up, one of my favorite wrestlers. I just mentioned he's one of the wrestlers whose autograph I have on my wall, Shinsuke Nakamura. Nakamura had 3 title reigns, defended the belt 9 times for a total of 390 days. And the reason why he's not on here, Nakamura's championships came early in his career, where he was a different character and he was more based on the shoot style wrestling. Antonio Inoki, for all his greatness and all his faults, in the early 2000s tried to show that pro wrestlers were the best combat sports athletes. So he was making his pro wrestlers do legitimate MMA fights, and more often than not, they lost. And it really put a damper on the importance of New Japan and all of pro wrestling in Japan just because of that. Nakamura is a little bit more, how shall I say, he was a little bit more successful than most people were, but he still was exposed a bit that way. And it feels like he went from being the super rookie, and it took him a long time before he really got into the Shinsuke Nakamura, the King of Strong style character that we eventually got to grew on us, and we loved eventually. The guy that just absolutely can light up any arena in the world without saying a word. For all that, he was considered, but he didn't quite make the list. Last but not least on the best of the rest, the cleaner, Kenny Omega. You could cut and paste a little bit of what I said with AJ Styles and carry it into Kenny Omega's run as the leader of the Bullet Club. Kenny Omega only had 1 title run, he had 3 defenses, and only carried the belt for 197 days. As you can see when you look at that compared to some of our other champions, that he didn't quite stack up numbers-wise, but his impact was immense. He kind of carried that Bullet Club ball and took it from AJ Styles when he took over as the leader of the Bullet Club and took it to another level. He exploded it more. It's hard to say right now, while we're still in the middle of it, just how much Kenny Omega is going to have an impact on professional wrestling. There is no AEW without Kenny Omega. There's no AEW without his IWGP run. There's no AEW without his match with Chris Jericho, without his matches with Kazuchika Okada. He built such a buzz for not only himself, but New Japan as a company, that New Japan felt comfortable coming over and expanding into America. That was the plan. They were going to expand to America. They already started doing shows, and they have New Japan Pro Wrestling Strong, my favorite wrestling show. That it all came from this era of New Japan. Unfortunately, the numbers didn't quite make him for the list. That's why he was considered, but didn't quite make it. Now, before I do get into my number 1 here, if you think I put someone too high, someone too low, left someone off the list altogether, let me know what you think. Hit me up in the comments here. Make sure you share, smash that like button, subscribe, all the things the YouTubers tell you to do. And our number 1 IWGP Heavyweight Champion, the great Antonio Inoki, 1 reign, 4 defenses, 325 days, And yes, his numbers don't stack up to a lot of the numbers on this list, but you cannot argue that anyone has had a bigger impact on New Japan Pro Wrestling and the IWGP Championship. He is the inaugural IWGP champion. No one has had a bigger impact than Antonio Inoki. Inoki wrestled everyone from Vader to Hogan to Ric Flair, and I'm not just talking about his IWGP run, his famous match with Muhammad Ali, the fact that he's the guy that started the company and he had the most invested in the company succeeding, and he's the reason why I even did this list. At the time of this recording, I believe it's just around a week that Mr. Inoki passed away. So he was the inspiration for me even doing this list. A lot of what I love about professional wrestling could be traced directly back to Antonio Inoki. A lot of my favorite things in pro wrestling, New Japan being one of them, can go back to him. The more shoot style, the strong style matches could go back to Antonio Inoki and his influence. I've said it before, and I've mentioned him on a couple of my other videos this week. There is no pro wrestling world the way it is now without the influence of Antonio Inoki. He was absolutely one of the icons of pro wrestling. If there's a Mount Rushmore of pro wrestling ever made, Antonio Inoki has to be on that Mount Rushmore. You put him on there, you put maybe Giant Baba, El Santo, maybe Hogan or Ric Flair. However you want to slice it, whether you want to go with in-ring talent, Inoki had it. When you go with charisma, Inoki had it. When you go with fandom, Inoki had it. When you go with influence, who could say in professional wrestling they had more influence on the sport of professional wrestling than Antonio Inoki did? And his influence even crossed over into the mixed martial arts world. A lot of people say there is no mixed martial arts without Inoki versus Ali, which is a terrible fight, but it was one of the earliest things where you've seen one discipline fighting another discipline and money being made off of it. I could go on and on, and I could talk about all of Inoki's achievements. The fact that he's the first holder of the championship, and his immense talents and his immense impact on the sport of pro wrestling is why I think he is the number one IWGP World Champion of all time. He's the reason, like I said, I made this list as a tribute for Mr. Inoki. It's just really sad that he has passed away, and I hope he's resting in peace. I hope all the best for him in his afterlife, because he put so many smiles on countless millions of people's faces, including mine. I mentioned this when Vince McMahon stepped down. My wrestling fandom is shaped by guys like Antonio Inoki. It's shaped by guys like Vince McMahon, like Jim Crockett. Without those guys laying the groundwork on what they did, I wouldn't go on to find guys like Mick Foley or Tanahashi or the Great Muta, AJ Styles. I wouldn't like wrestling as much as I did without the groundwork that guys like those guys left. And they put a template out there to be followed. His impact's going to be felt as long as pro wrestling is around. Antonio Inoki's impact is going to be on there. His finger's always going to be on the pulse of it. He's a guy that the lifeblood of pro wrestling coursed through Antonio Inoki. Now, with all that being said, again, if you think I put something too high, something too low, hit me up in the comments. And if you made it all the way to the end, let me know who your favorite IWGP champion is. You don't have to go with any criteria. You don't have to go with the number of reigns. It could just be the one that was your personal favorite. Let me know down here in the comments. With all that being said, my name is George Coles, and this was another Heel Heat Top 10.